Picture this. A quiet English teacher walks into her classroom one morning to find her carefully organized books scattered across the floor, torn pages fluttering like broken wings, and her life's work destroyed by a group of students who thought they knew exactly who they were dealing with. What these bullies didn't realize was that beneath her gentle exterior lived a warrior who had spent 15 years mastering an ancient art that could humble giants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who never show their claws until pushed too far. What happens when respect is demanded rather than asked for? Stay with me, because this story will completely change how you see the power of quiet strength. The autumn morning mist still clung to the windows of Riverside Academy when Sarah Chen pulled her small Honda into the faculty parking lot. At 28 years old, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that made her seem both approachable and mysteriously distant. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she favored cardigans in soft colors that complemented her warm brown eyes. What people noticed most about Sarah was how she moved through the world with an unusual stillness, as if she were perpetually listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. This was her first week at Riverside Academy, a sprawling suburban high school that served both the affluent neighborhoods on the hill and the working-class families in the valley below. The building itself was a maze of interconnected wings built over several decades, creating a labyrinthine structure where even teachers sometimes got lost. The morning hallways buzzed with the familiar symphony of teenage life, locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, and the constant hum of conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Sarah had spent the previous evening arranging her new classroom with the meticulous care of someone who understood that environment shapes experience. Room 237 was located in the English wing, a corner classroom with large windows that faced the courtyard where students gathered during lunch. She had arranged her desk to face both the door and the student seats, a habit formed during her years teaching in more challenging environments. Her personal library, collected over years of teaching and studying literature, filled 3 tall bookcases that she had positioned strategically around the room. These books were more than just teaching materials to Sarah. They were companions that had traveled with her from her first teaching position in downtown Portland, through her graduate studies, and now to this new chapter at Riverside Academy. Each volume held memories. The worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that had sparked breakthrough discussions about justice, the anthology of contemporary poetry that had helped a shy student find her voice, the collection of short stories that had become a bridge between her and students who initially saw reading as punishment rather than pleasure. Sarah's approach to teaching English was unconventional but effective. She believed that literature wasn't something to be dissected and analyzed until all life was drained from it, but rather a living thing that could help students understand themselves and their world more deeply. Her lesson plans reflected this philosophy, incorporating creative writing exercises, dramatic readings, and discussions that connected classic texts to contemporary issues that mattered to teenagers. What her new colleagues and students didn't know was that Sarah's calm demeanor and thoughtful approach to conflict resolution had been forged in an entirely different arena. For the past 15 years, since she was 13 years old, Sarah had been studying Shotokan karate under Master Tanaka, a 70-year-old Japanese immigrant who had opened a small dojo in the basement of a community center. The dojo was nothing fancy, just mirrors, punching bags, and worn mats that had absorbed the sweat and determination of hundreds of students over the years. Sarah had initially been drawn to karate not out of any desire to fight, but because she had been a painfully shy child who struggled to find her voice in a world that seemed to reward the loudest speakers. Master Tanaka had recognized something in the quiet 12-year-old who showed up to his beginner's class wearing an oversized GI that had belonged to her older brother. While other students focused on the flashy kicks and dramatic techniques they saw in movies, Sarah had been drawn to the philosophical aspects of the martial art, the emphasis on discipline, respect, and the idea that true strength came from knowing when not to use your power. Over the years, as Sarah progressed through the ranks from white belt to black belt and eventually to third-degree black belt, she had learned that karate was as much about mental discipline as physical technique. Master Tanaka had taught her that the most advanced practitioners were often indistinguishable from ordinary people because they had no need to advertise their capabilities. The strongest tree, he would often say, bends with the wind rather than breaking against it. But when the storm becomes too fierce, even the gentle tree must reveal its deep roots. Sarah's teaching philosophy had been deeply influenced by her martial arts training. Just as she had learned to read an opponent's intentions through subtle shifts in posture and breathing, she had developed an uncanny ability to sense the dynamics in a classroom. She could identify the natural leaders, the struggling students who masked their insecurity with defiance, and the quiet ones who had important things to say if given the right opportunity. Her first few days at Riverside Academy had gone smoothly. Her classes were engaged, her lesson plans were well received by the administration, and she had begun to form connections with several students who reminded her why she had chosen teaching as her profession. There was Emma, a junior who wrote poetry with surprising sophistication, but was convinced she wasn't smart enough for advanced classes. There was David, a senior who had been labeled a troublemaker by previous teachers, but who showed genuine insight when discussing the moral complexities in the novels they were reading. However, Sarah had also noticed a particular group of students who seemed to operate by different rules than the rest of the school. They called themselves the crew, though most students referred to them simply as the group you didn't mess with. The unofficial leader was Brandon Mitchell, a 17-year-old senior who had the kind of natural charisma that could have made him a positive force in the school if it had been channeled differently. Instead, Brandon used his influence to maintain a small kingdom built on intimidation and casual cruelty. Brandon was tall and athletic, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. His father owned several successful businesses in town, and the family's donations to various school programs had created a protective bubble around Brandon that previous teachers and administrators had been reluctant to burst. He had mastered the art of staying just within the boundaries of what could be officially disciplined while making life miserable for anyone who crossed him. His closest allies were Ryan Torres and Alex Kim, two students who had found their identity as extensions of Brandon's will. Ryan was built like a linebacker, with thick shoulders and hands that he used to emphasize his points through playful shoves and accidental collisions in the hallway. Alex was smaller, but possessed a cruel intelligence that made him particularly effective at psychological warfare. He could identify a person's insecurities with surgical precision and exploit them with comments that sounded almost innocent to adult ears, but cut deeply into his targets. The crew's domain extended throughout Riverside Academy, but they were particularly territorial about the areas they considered theirs: the senior parking lot, the tables near the vending machines in the cafeteria, and the section of hallway outside the main office where they could observe the comings and goings of the entire school. They had developed an elaborate system of pranks, rumors, and social manipulation that allowed them to control the social hierarchy without leaving fingerprints that could be traced back to them. What made the crew particularly effective was their understanding of institutional dynamics. They were careful never to target students whose parents had influence or whose disappearance from school activities would be noticed by administrators. Instead, they focused on the vulnerable: transfer students who hadn't yet established social connections, kids from families who were too busy working multiple jobs to get involved in school politics, and anyone who showed signs of being different in ways that couldn't be easily defended. Their methods were sophisticated and varied. Sometimes it was as simple as spreading rumors that would isolate a student from their friend group. Other times it involved more elaborate schemes, convincing teachers that certain students were cheating, orchestrating situations where their targets would be humiliated in front of large groups, or using social media to amplify embarrassing moments until they became defining characteristics. The crew had been watching Sarah Chen since her first day at Riverside Academy, assessing her the way predators evaluate potential prey. They had developed profiles of every teacher in the school, understanding which ones could be manipulated, which ones posed threats, and which ones could be safely ignored. Most new teachers fell into predictable categories: the eager young educators who tried too hard to be liked and could be easily manipulated, the strict disciplinarians who created clear battle lines, or the burned-out veterans who just wanted to make it through each day without incident. Sarah, however, didn't fit neatly into any of these categories. She was friendly but not desperate for approval, firm but not unnecessarily harsh, and there was something about her presence that made even Brandon feel slightly off balance. When she looked at him during class discussions, he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was seeing more than he wanted to reveal. It was a feeling he wasn't accustomed to, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. The first test came during Sarah's second week at the school. She had assigned her students to read the opening chapters of Lord of the Flies and come prepared to discuss the breakdown of civilization when institutional structures disappear. It was a unit she had taught many times before, and she was particularly skilled at helping students connect Golding's themes to contemporary examples of how power dynamics shape behavior in groups. Brandon saw the assignment as an opportunity to establish dominance in what he perceived as his territory. He had done this before with new teachers: create a situation where they would be forced to choose between maintaining classroom control and avoiding conflict. Most teachers, especially young female teachers, would back down rather than risk escalation. This retreat would signal to the rest of the class that the teacher was not someone who commanded respect, making future disruptions easier and more effective. On the day of the discussion, Brandon came to class prepared with a strategy. He had read enough of the assignment to participate in the conversation, but his real focus was on testing boundaries. He started small, making comments that were technically on topic but delivered with a tone that suggested he was humoring the teacher rather than engaging seriously with the material. When Sarah asked about the significance of the conch shell as a symbol of democratic order, Brandon responded with an exaggerated formality that made several students snicker. "Well, Miss Chen," he said, drawing out her name in a way that somehow made it sound dismissive, "I suppose the conch represents how people need to be told what to do because they're too weak to figure it out themselves. Kinda like how we need teachers to tell us what books mean, because apparently we're too stupid to understand them on our own." Sarah recognized the challenge immediately. She had seen this exact dynamic play out in previous schools, and she understood that her response would set the tone for the rest of the semester. The traditional approaches would be to either ignore the comment and hope it went away, or to respond with disciplinary action that would likely escalate the conflict. Instead, Sarah chose a third path, one that drew on her years of martial arts training. In karate, Master Tanaka had taught her about the concept of irimi, which involved entering into an opponent's attack rather than retreating from it. The idea was to get close enough to neutralize the threat while simultaneously demonstrating that you were not intimidated by aggression. Applied to classroom management, this meant acknowledging Brandon's challenge while redirecting the energy toward productive discussion. "That's an interesting interpretation, Brandon," Sarah said, her voice maintaining its usual calm tone. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "You're right that the conch represents external authority, but I think you're onto something deeper. What do you think Golding is suggesting about the relationship between individual strength and collective responsibility? Because it sounds like you're arguing that real strength means not needing external validation or control." The response caught Brandon off guard. He had expected either defensiveness or authority-based pushback, but Sarah had done neither. Instead, she had taken his challenge and used it as a launching point for exactly the kind of deep discussion he had been trying to avoid. Several other students, sensing that something interesting was happening, began to engage with the question Sarah had posed. Emma, the poetry-writing junior, raised her hand tentatively. "I think maybe the point is that individual strength and group cooperation aren't opposites. Like, Ralph is strong, but he's also trying to create systems that help everyone survive. Jack is strong too, but he uses his strength to dominate rather than protect." David, the student who had been labeled a troublemaker, nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, and the scary thing is how quickly everything falls apart. These aren't bad kids necessarily, but when there are no consequences, some of them become monsters. It makes you wonder what any of us would do in that situation." Sarah felt the familiar excitement that came when a class discussion achieved its own momentum. This was why she loved teaching. These moments when literature became a lens through which students could examine their own lives and choices. She could see that even some of Brandon's usual followers were genuinely engaged with the ideas being discussed. Brandon, however, was not pleased with how his disruption had been transformed into productive learning. He tried a different approach, leaning back in his chair with deliberate casualness. "I mean, it's just a book, right? These are made-up characters doing made-up things. I don't see why we have to pretend it's so deep and meaningful." Again, Sarah resisted the temptation to take the bait. "You know what, Brandon? You're absolutely right that these are fictional characters. but fiction has been used for thousands of years to explore real human behavior in extreme situations. The Greeks used theater, medieval writers used allegories, and modern authors use novels. What do you think makes fiction effective for examining things that might be too painful or complex to look at directly in real life? This time, Alex Kim jumped in, apparently deciding to support his friend's resistance. Maybe because it's easier to judge fake people than to admit that we might do the same things in their situation. Like, everyone always says they would have been the ones hiding Jews during the Holocaust, but statistically, most people were either Nazis or bystanders. Sarah paused, recognizing that Alex had inadvertently made a profound point that could deepen the entire discussion. Alex, that's exactly the kind of insight that makes literature valuable. You're connecting Golding's exploration of human nature under stress to historical examples of how ordinary people respond to extreme circumstances. What do you think determines which way someone goes when the normal rules break down? The discussion that followed was one of the best Sarah had experienced in her teaching career. Students who rarely participated began sharing their thoughts, and even Brandon found himself drawn into genuine analysis despite his initial resistance. By the end of the class period, they had covered not just the assigned reading, but had explored themes of moral courage, social responsibility, and the psychological factors that influence individual behavior in group settings. As students filed out of the classroom, Sarah felt the satisfaction of a successful lesson, but she also recognized that she had won only a small battle in what might become a longer war. Brandon's exit expression suggested that he viewed the day's events not as educational success, but as a personal defeat that would require response. She was right. That afternoon, as Sarah worked late in her classroom preparing materials for the next day's lessons, Brandon convened a meeting of the crew in the senior parking lot. The three boys sat on the tailgate of Ryan's pickup truck, sharing a bag of fast food and planning their next move. "She thinks she's clever," Brandon said, his voice carrying the edge it got when his authority was challenged. "Did you see how she turned everything around on us? Made it look like we were actually participating in her stupid discussion." Ryan nodded, though he seemed less bothered by the day's events than his leader. "I mean, it wasn't that bad. Some of the stuff people were saying was actually kind of interesting." Brandon turned to stare at Ryan with the kind of cold intensity that had kept the crew in line for 3 years. "Interesting?" "Ryan, the point isn't whether it's interesting. The point is that she's trying to control us, just like every other teacher in this place. The difference is that she's sneaky about it. She makes you think you're choosing to participate when really she's manipulating you into doing exactly what she wants." Alex, who prided himself on understanding psychological warfare, saw where Brandon was heading. "So what do you want to do about it? We can't use the usual stuff on her. She's too smart, and she doesn't seem to get flustered easily." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, considering options. The crew's previous campaigns had relied on teachers responding predictably to provocation, but Sarah Chen had already demonstrated that she wouldn't follow the script. This meant they needed a different approach, something that would force her into a position where her composure wouldn't protect her. "Her books," Brandon said finally. "Did you see how she looks at those books? The way she arranges them, talks about them, handles them like they're precious or something. I bet she's one of those teachers who thinks books are sacred." Ryan looked uncertain. "I don't know, man. Messing with someone's personal stuff feels different than just giving them a hard time in class." "Everything in that classroom is school property," Brandon replied smoothly. "We're not breaking into her house. We're just rearranging some educational materials. Besides, it's not like we're going to destroy anything valuable. They're just books." Alex was already warming to the idea. It could work. Teachers like her, they invest so much of their identity in their materials, their classroom setup. If we disrupt that, it might throw her off balance enough that she'll either overreact or back down. Either way, we win. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. They would wait until after school, when most teachers had left, but while the building was still open for sports practices and other activities. The custodial staff was familiar with the crew and rarely questioned their presence in the building, especially since Brandon's father had made substantial donations to the athletic programs. They would enter Sarah's classroom, carefully rearrange her book collection in ways that would be immediately noticeable but not obviously malicious, and then wait to see how she responded. If Sarah reported the incident to administration, she would look paranoid and oversensitive. After all, nothing would actually be damaged or stolen, just moved around. If she didn't report it, she would know that her space could be invaded at any time, creating a sense of vulnerability that would undermine her classroom confidence. Either outcome would demonstrate that the crew could reach her whenever they chose, establishing the power dynamic that Brandon needed to maintain his position in the school's social hierarchy. What Brandon and his friends didn't realize was that their plan would force Sarah to make a choice she had been hoping to avoid. For 15 years, she had trained in an art that emphasized restraint, patience, and the importance of using minimum force to achieve maximum effect. Master Tanaka had taught her that the highest level of martial arts mastery was never needing to fight, because potential opponents recognized something in your bearing that warned them away. But Master Tanaka had also taught her that there were times when avoidance was no longer possible, when the principles of peace and respect could only be preserved through decisive action. The way of the warrior, he had often said, is to exhaust all peaceful options before drawing the sword. But when the sword must be drawn, it should be drawn completely. Sarah had never had to apply this philosophy in a school setting before. Her previous positions had been in schools where the challenges were different: poverty, family instability, and social issues that created educational barriers, but rarely the kind of calculated psychological warfare that the crew specialized in. She had dealt with disrupted students, angry parents, and administrative pressure, but never with opponents who combined intelligence, resources, and patience in service of cruelty. As she locked her classroom door that evening and walked to her car, Sarah felt the familiar awareness that came from years of training. Something was shifting in the dynamics around her, and her instincts were telling her to prepare for escalation. She spent the drive home considering her options and reminding herself of the principles that had guided her through previous challenges. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment grading papers and thinking about the day's events. Her living space reflected the same careful attention to environment that characterized her classroom. Books organized by topic and personal significance, plants positioned to catch optimal light, furniture arranged to create spaces for different activities. On her bedroom wall hung a single piece of calligraphy that Master Tanaka had given her when she earned her black belt. The characters spelled out a Japanese proverb: "The nail that stands up gets hammered down, but the nail that bends becomes part of the structure." Sarah understood that she was approaching one of those moments that would define not just her experience at Riverside Academy, but potentially her entire approach to teaching. She could continue to rely on patience and redirection, hoping that Brandon and his friends would eventually move on to other targets. She could escalate through official channels, documenting incidents, and building a case for administrative intervention. Or she could prepare for the possibility that more direct action might become necessary. As she prepared for bed, Sarah performed the meditation routine that had been part of her evening practice for over a decade. Sitting in Caesar position on a small cushion, she focused on her breathing and tried to clear her mind of the day's tensions. But tonight, instead of achieving the usual sense of calm, she found herself thinking about Master Tanaka's lessons on the warrior's mindset. A true martial artist, he had taught her, hopes never to use their skills in combat, but they train every day as if their life depends on their readiness. The contradiction is that the more prepared you are to fight, the less likely it becomes that you will need to fight. Your opponents sense your readiness and choose easier targets. Sarah realized that she had been so focused on being the kind of teacher she wanted to be that she had perhaps forgotten to project the kind of presence that would discourage those who might mistake kindness for weakness. Tomorrow, she decided she would pay closer attention to the subtle communications that occurred beneath the surface of classroom interactions. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the drive to school pleasant and gave students extra energy. Sarah arrived at her usual time, about 45 minutes before first period, and used her key to enter the building through the faculty entrance. The hallways were quiet except for the distant sounds of custodial work and the early arriving teachers who, like her, preferred to have time to prepare before the day's chaos began. Sarah approached her classroom door with the same awareness she brought to entering the dojo. Years of training had taught her to notice details that others might miss. The quality of light, the position of objects, the subtle signs that indicated whether a space had been disturbed. Before she even inserted her key in the lock, she knew something was different. The feeling was confirmed the moment she opened the door and stepped into room 237. Her books had been rearranged with malicious precision. The volumes weren't damaged or destroyed, but they had been moved in ways that demonstrated both the intruder's access to her space and their understanding of what would disturb her most. Her carefully organized sections were mixed together, favorite volumes were separated from their companions, and several books were positioned in ways that suggested mockery. A collection of feminist literature placed spine down on the floor. A volume of poetry opened to a page about resilience and left face down on her desk. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the full scope of what had been done. Her first emotion was not anger, but sadness. These books represented years of careful collection, countless hours of reading and preparation, and memories of students whose lives had been touched by the ideas contained within their pages. To see them treated as objects in a power game felt like a violation that went beyond mere pranking. But as Sarah moved through the classroom, examining the extent of the rearrangement, her sadness began to transform into something else. The precision of the disruption revealed the amount of time and thought that had gone into the invasion. This wasn't random vandalism or a spontaneous act of rebellion. This was a calculated attack designed to make her feel vulnerable and off balance. A psychological warfare tactic that suggested her opponents understood exactly what they were doing. Sarah began the process of returning her books to their proper places, but as she worked, she was also thinking strategically. The three boys who had done this expected her to either report the incident or suffer in silence. They had created a situation where traditional responses would either make her look foolish or leave her feeling helpless. But Sarah had been trained in an approach to conflict that offered other options. Master Tanaka had taught her about the concept of sen no sen, which involved perceiving an opponent's intention before they acted and responding to their plan rather than their action. In this case, Brandon and his friends had revealed their strategy. They intended to use psychological pressure to establish dominance. Understanding their approach gave Sarah the opportunity to choose her own response, rather than simply reacting to their provocation. As she reshelved her books, Sarah found herself thinking about the lesson she had planned for that day's classes. They were going to continue discussing Lord of the Flies, focusing on the character of Piggy and how intelligence without physical power or social status becomes vulnerable to those who prefer force to reason. The irony was not lost on her that her own situation paralleled themes from the novel her students were reading. But Sarah also remembered how the story ended, with the arrival of external authority that forced the boys to confront the reality of their actions. Sometimes Golding seemed to suggest civilization required more than good intentions and reasoned discussion. Sometimes it required the credible threat of consequences for those who chose to prey on others. By the time her first period students began arriving, Sarah had restored her classroom to its previous organization. She greeted her students with the same warm professionalism she always displayed, and launched into the day's lesson as if nothing had happened. But several students, particularly those who were sensitive to emotional undercurrents, noticed something different in their teacher's energy. She seemed more focused somehow, more present, as if she were paying attention to things that had previously been peripheral to her awareness. Brandon arrived to third period with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was looking forward to seeing the results of the previous evening's work. He took his usual seat in the back row and waited for signs that his psychological warfare had been effective. But, as the class period progressed, he became increasingly puzzled by Sarah's demeanor. She seemed completely unaffected by what should have been a deeply unsettling violation of her space. Sarah, meanwhile, was conducting what amounted to reconnaissance. She observed Brandon's body language, noting the expectant way he watched her movements and the disappointed expression that flickered across his face when she failed to show signs of distress. She also paid attention to Ryan and Alex, cataloging the glances they exchanged and the way they seemed to be waiting for something to happen. The day's discussion focused on the moment in Lord of the Flies, when Jack's tribe steals Piggy's glasses, the tool that had allowed the boys to maintain their signal fire and their hope of rescue. Sarah guided the conversation toward the symbolic significance of the theft, how taking someone's ability to see clearly was both a practical and psychological attack, designed to render the victim helpless while demonstrating the perpetrator's power. "What's interesting about this scene," Sarah said, her eyes moving across the classroom but lingering a moment longer on the crew, is how Jack's tribe justifies the theft. They don't see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as taking what they need from people who are too weak to defend their possessions. What do you think Golding is suggesting about how people rationalize actions that they know are wrong? Emma raised her hand, her voice stronger than it had been in previous discussions. I think he's showing how easy it is to convince yourself that might makes right. Like, if you can take something, then maybe you deserve to have it more than the person who can't protect it. David nodded, building on her point. But the scary thing is that once you start thinking that way, there's no limit to what you can justify. First you're stealing glasses, then you're destroying property, then you're hurting people. Each step seems reasonable if you've already accepted the step before it. Sarah felt a moment of pride in her students' insights, but she also recognized that they were describing the exact psychological process that had led to her classroom being invaded. The crew had convinced themselves that her books were fair game because she was new, because she was different, because she represented some kind of threat to their established order. As the discussion continued, Sarah made a decision that would have surprised Master Tanaka with its boldness. Rather than waiting for the next escalation, she chose to send a message that would demonstrate her awareness of what was happening without directly confronting her opponents. You know, she said, her voice maintaining its usual conversational tone, this theme of respecting other people's property and space shows up in literature across cultures and centuries. There's something universal about the idea that violating someone's personal boundaries is a form of aggression, even when no physical harm is intended. It's as if humans instinctively understand that our possessions and our spaces are extensions of ourselves, and attacking them is a way of attacking us without leaving obvious evidence. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly uncertain whether Sarah's comments were general observations or pointed messages. The other members of the crew exchanged glances, trying to determine whether their teacher was addressing them specifically or simply continuing the academic discussion. Sarah continued, her tone remaining academic but her words carefully chosen. What's particularly interesting is how people respond when their boundaries are violated. Some become fearful and withdraw, which often encourages further aggression. Others escalate immediately, which can lead to conflicts that spiral out of control. But there's a third response that shows up frequently in literature, the character who appears unchanged by the violation, but is actually preparing a more strategic response. She paused, allowing the words to sink in, then smiled with the same warmth she had shown throughout the week. But enough literary analysis for now. Let's look at the specific techniques Golding uses to show Jack's transformation from choir boy to tribal leader. What are the small details that signal his increasing comfort with violence? The remainder of the class period proceeded normally, but Brandon left the room with the uncomfortable feeling that he had somehow lost ground rather than gained it. Sarah's response to their invasion had been completely unexpected. Instead of being intimidated or reporting the incident, she had used it as material for literary discussion while simultaneously letting them know that she understood exactly what had happened. That afternoon, the crew reconvened in their usual meeting spot, but the mood was different than it had been the previous day. Ryan seemed genuinely troubled by the morning's events, while Alex was intrigued by what he saw as an escalation in the psychological warfare they had begun. Brandon was angry, frustrated by his inability to predict and control his opponent's responses. She knows, Alex said without preamble. That whole discussion about boundaries and property was directed at us. She's letting us know that she's aware of what we did without actually accusing us of anything. Ryan nodded reluctantly. Maybe we should just back off. I mean, she's not causing us any real problems. Her classes are actually kind of interesting, and she's not trying to get us in trouble with administration. Brandon turned on his friend with the kind of cold fury that had kept the crew together through 3 years of dominance. Back off? Ryan, do you hear yourself? She violated the fundamental rule of this place. New teachers defer to established students until they prove they deserve respect. Instead, she's acting like she belongs here, like she has some kind of authority over us. But she is a teacher, Ryan replied, his voice uncertain but persistent. She does have authority over us. That's how schools work. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental philosophy that drove Brandon's behavior and explained why Sarah represented such a threat to his worldview. In Brandon's mind, Riverside Academy was not primarily an educational institution, but a social ecosystem where power was earned through dominance rather than granted through official positions. Teachers who understood this system could be respected if they proved themselves worthy through strength, intelligence, or the kind of charisma that commanded natural deference. Teachers who failed to understand the system could be manipulated, intimidated, or simply ignored until they either adapted or left. But teachers like Sarah, who seemed to operate according to entirely different rules, represented a fundamental challenge to the order that had given Brandon's life meaning and purpose for 3 years. As the boys talked, it became clear that they were approaching a crossroads. Ryan was beginning to question whether their campaign against Sarah was worth the potential consequences, especially since she hadn't actually done anything to harm them. Alex was fascinated by the strategic complexity of dealing with an opponent who refused to play by the expected rules. And Brandon was becoming increasingly committed to a course of action that he saw as necessary to preserve his position and authority. The decision they reached would set in motion a series of events that would test everything Sarah had learned about teaching, about martial arts, and about the delicate balance between peace and strength that defined her approach to life. As the 3 boys finalized their plans for a more dramatic escalation, none of them fully understood that they were about to discover the difference between a teacher who avoided conflict and a warrior who simply preferred not to fight. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform not just their individual lives but the entire culture of Riverside Academy. Sarah Chen, who had spent 15 years learning to bend like bamboo in the wind, was about to discover whether her deep roots were strong enough to withstand a storm that threatened everything she had worked to build. The following week brought an unseasonable warmth to Riverside Academy, the kind of Indian summer weather that made students restless and teachers grateful for air conditioning. Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine with most of her classes, but she remained acutely aware that her encounter with the crew was far from over. The rearrangement of her books had been an opening move in what she recognized as a carefully orchestrated campaign, and her response had likely escalated rather than diffused the situation. During her morning preparation time, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the subtle rhythms of the school building. She noticed which custodians worked, which shifts, when security guards made their rounds, and how the administrative staff monitored after-hours activities. These observations weren't driven by paranoia, but by the same strategic thinking that had helped her advance through the ranks of karate. Master Tanaka had always emphasized that awareness was the foundation of effective defense, and Sarah was beginning to suspect that she would need every advantage she could gather. Her instincts proved correct when she arrived at school on Thursday morning to find that the crew had escalated their psychological warfare with sophisticated precision. This time, they hadn't simply rearranged her books. Instead, they had conducted what could only be described as a surgical strike against her classroom environment. Her carefully curated collection of student work displays had been subtly altered, with inspirational quotes replaced by seemingly innocent phrases that carried undertones of mockery. Her bulletin board about literary themes now featured anonymous additions that transformed her educational messages into subtle threats. Most disturbing was what they had done to her personal copy of The Art of War, a book she kept on her desk as both a teaching resource and a reminder of the strategic thinking that underpinned effective conflict resolution. The ancient text had been left open to a specific passage about knowing your enemy, with certain words highlighted in yellow marker. The message was clear. The crew wanted her to understand that they were studying her just as carefully as she was observing them. Sarah spent her first period planning time restoring her classroom while analyzing the psychology behind the new invasion. The sophistication of the alterations suggested that Brandon and his friends had spent considerable time researching her background and teaching materials. They had demonstrated not only their ability to access her space repeatedly, but also their commitment to a sustained campaign of psychological pressure. This was no longer teenage pranking, but something approaching genuine warfare. The realization brought with it a familiar sensation from her martial arts training, the moment when sparring transforms from practice into genuine combat. Master Tanaka had taught her to recognize this transition through subtle changes in an opponent's energy and focus. When someone stops playing and starts fighting, he had explained, their entire demeanor shifts from casual engagement to predatory intensity. Sarah could feel that shift happening now, not just in the crew's behavior, but in her own response to their escalation. Her second period class was American literature with juniors, including Emma, the shy poet who had been finding her voice through their discussions of classic texts. As students filed into the room, Sarah noticed that several of them seemed nervous, glancing around the classroom as if they expected something to happen. The whisper network that connected all high school students had apparently spread word that something was brewing between their teacher and the school's most notorious group. Emma approached Sarah's desk before class began, her usual hesitancy replaced by genuine concern. "Miss Chen, some people are saying that Brandon and his friends are planning something big. I don't know what it is, but I thought you should know that people are talking." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for the young woman's courage in approaching her, but also a deeper concern about what it meant that students were aware of the conflict brewing beneath the surface of normal school operations. The fact that Emma felt compelled to warn her suggested that the crew's reputation for escalation was well established among the student body. "Thank you for telling me, Emma," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the calm reassurance that had become her trademark. "I appreciate your concern, and I want you to know that whatever happens, it won't affect our classroom or our learning environment. Some people test boundaries because they don't understand that real strength comes from self-control rather than intimidation." Emma nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "It's just that they've done this before with other teachers. They start small and keep pushing until something breaks. Most teachers either leave or just stop caring about their classes. I don't want that to happen to you because your class is the first time I've actually enjoyed learning about literature." The conversation reinforced Sarah's growing understanding that her conflict with the crew was about more than personal pride or professional authority. Students like Emma, David, and dozens of others were watching to see whether someone would finally stand up to the pattern of intimidation that had shaped the social climate at Riverside Academy for years. Her response would signal to an entire generation of students whether intelligence, creativity, and genuine engagement could coexist with strength, or whether survival required either submission or cruelty. The day's lesson focused on Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, a story that Sarah had always found useful for exploring themes of revenge, manipulation, and the psychology of people who hide their true intentions behind masks of civility. As she guided the discussion, she found herself drawing parallels between Montresor's calculated campaign against Fortunato and the kind of strategic thinking that characterized more sophisticated forms of bullying. "What makes Montresor particularly dangerous," Sarah explained to her attentive class, "isn't his anger or his desire for revenge. Those emotions are relatively straightforward and predictable. What makes him dangerous is his patience, his planning, and his ability to manipulate his victim's trust and vanity. He understands exactly what kind of person Fortunato is, and he uses that knowledge to create a situation where his enemy destroys himself." David raised his hand, his expression thoughtful. "So you're saying that the scariest people aren't the ones who lose their temper and explode, but the ones who stay calm and think 3 steps ahead?" "Exactly," Sarah replied, noticing how several students were nodding in recognition. Poe understood that true malice requires intelligence and self-control. Random violence is frightening, but strategic manipulation is terrifying because it's so much harder to defend against. As the discussion continued, Sarah became aware that her analysis of Poe's psychological insights was serving a dual purpose. Her students were gaining genuine understanding of literary techniques and thematic development, but she was also sending a message to anyone who might be listening that she understood the difference between impulsive aggression and calculated intimidation. If the crew was monitoring her classes for signs of weakness or defensive reactions, they would instead hear evidence of someone who had clearly thought deeply about the mechanics of psychological warfare. The message was received exactly as Sarah had intended. Alex Kim, who had been using his computer programming skills to monitor various aspects of the school's digital infrastructure, reported back to Brandon that their English teacher had spent an entire class period discussing strategic thinking and psychological manipulation. Rather than being intimidated by their escalating campaign, she appeared to be using their conflict as educational material while simultaneously demonstrating her analytical sophistication. Brandon's reaction to this intelligence was a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. He had expected Sarah to either retreat or escalate through official channels, but instead she was treating their conflict as an intellectual exercise while continuing to project absolute confidence in her ability to handle whatever they might attempt. This response was outside his experience with previous targets, and it forced him to consider the possibility that he had significantly underestimated his opponent. The crew's next strategy session took place that afternoon in the abandoned photography darkroom in the basement of the arts building. The space had been unused since the school transitioned to digital photography, making it an ideal location for private conversations that couldn't be overheard by faculty or administration. Brandon had discovered the room during his freshman year and had been using it as a planning center for the crew's activities ever since. "She's playing games," Brandon announced as the three boys settled into the makeshift seating they had created from old darkroom equipment. "She's trying to show us that she's not afraid, but everyone has a breaking point. We just haven't found hers yet." Ryan shifted uncomfortably on his improvised chair, his expression reflecting the doubts that had been growing stronger with each escalation. "Maybe her breaking point is higher than we think. Maybe she's not the kind of person who breaks at all. Some people are just naturally tougher than others." Alex leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued by the strategic challenge their teacher represented. "Actually, I think Ryan might be onto something. I've been doing some research on Ms. Chen, trying to find social media accounts, background information, anything that might give us insight into who she really is. What I found is interesting." He pulled out his laptop and opened a folder containing screenshots and printed articles. "She doesn't have much of an online presence, which is unusual for someone her age. But I found a few references to her previous teaching positions, and there's a pattern. She's worked in some really tough schools, places where most teachers burn out within 2 years. But her student evaluations are consistently excellent, and she seems to have a reputation for handling difficult situations without administrative support." Brandon studied the information with the intensity he usually reserved for planning elaborate pranks. "So you're saying she's experienced with troublemakers? That doesn't make her invulnerable. It just means we need to be more creative." "I'm saying maybe we should consider the possibility that we're not just dealing with a typical new teacher," Alex replied carefully. "There's something different about her energy, the way she moves, the way she responds to pressure. I think she might have some kind of background we don't know about." Ryan nodded emphatically. "That's what I've been trying to tell you guys. She's not acting like someone who's afraid of us, or even someone who's trying to prove she's not afraid. She's acting like someone who already knows exactly how this is going to end." The observation hung in the air between them, forcing Brandon to confront a possibility he had been avoiding. What if Sarah Chen wasn't playing defense at all? What if she was simply allowing them to reveal their capabilities and intentions while she assessed the full scope of the threat they represented? The idea was unsettling because it suggested that he might not be the strategist in their conflict, but merely a reactive participant in someone else's larger plan. Brandon's response to this uncomfortable realization was to double down on escalation rather than reconsider his approach. "Then we force her to show her hand," he declared with the kind of false confidence that often preceded his most reckless decisions. "Whatever background she has, whatever experience she thinks makes her untouchable, we'll find a way to get past it. Everyone has something they care about more than their professional image." The plan they developed over the next hour was more ambitious and potentially destructive than anything the crew had attempted before. Rather than limiting themselves to her classroom, they would extend their campaign to every aspect of Sarah's professional life at Riverside Academy. They would interfere with her lesson planning by accessing her computer files, disrupt her relationships with other faculty members through strategic rumors and misinformation, and create situations where her classroom management would be tested by orchestrated disruptions involving students outside the crew. Most significantly, they decided to target the upcoming parent-teacher conferences, scheduled for the following week. Brandon's father had substantial influence in the community and the school district, and Brandon was confident he could manipulate parental concerns about Sarah's unconventional teaching methods and her focus on potentially controversial literary themes. If they could create enough pressure from influential parents, they could potentially force her resignation without having to defeat her directly. As they finalized their strategy, none of the three boys fully understood that they were crossing a line that would fundamentally change the nature of their conflict with Sarah. Up to this point, their actions had been directed at her personally, but had remained within the bounds of what could be dismissed as teenage rebellion. By expanding their campaign to include interference with her professional responsibilities and relationships, they were moving into territory that threatened not just her comfort, but her career and livelihood. Sarah, meanwhile, was conducting her own strategic analysis during her evening routine at home. After completing her grading and lesson planning, she sat in meditation position and reflected on the day's events. The escalation pattern was clear, and she could see that the crew was building toward some kind of major confrontation. The question was whether they would limit themselves to psychological warfare or whether their campaign would eventually require more direct response. Master Tanaka had taught her that the most important strategic decision in any conflict was determining when defensive tactics were no longer sufficient to protect what mattered most. A warrior who only defends, he had often said, eventually loses everything worth defending. There comes a moment when the way of peace requires the willingness to fight. Sarah had reached that moment several times in her life, though never in a professional context. Growing up in a neighborhood where predators tested anyone who appeared vulnerable, she had learned that projecting strength required occasional demonstrations that the strength was real. Her reputation in the community had eventually made such demonstrations unnecessary, but only after she had proven that her calm demeanor masked genuine capability. The principles were the same in any environment, but the application required careful consideration of context and consequences. In her previous neighborhood, physical confrontation was an accepted part of the social ecosystem, and her martial arts skills were assets that could be displayed without professional risk. At Riverside Academy, any physical response would likely end her teaching career and might result in legal consequences, regardless of the circumstances that provoked it. This limitation meant that Sarah needed to find ways to project strength and establish boundaries without crossing lines that would make her the aggressor in the eyes of administration or law enforcement. She needed to demonstrate her capability in ways that would deter further escalation while maintaining her position as the wronged party who had exhausted all reasonable alternatives before resorting to more decisive action. The solution came to her during her Friday morning preparation period, when she discovered the latest phase of the crew's campaign. Someone had gained access to her computer and altered several of her lesson plans, replacing her carefully crafted discussion questions with prompts that were designed to create controversy and potentially offend parents or administrators. Her gradebook had been modified to show failing grades for several high-achieving students, and her email account contained messages that appeared to have been sent to other faculty members but which she had never written. The sophistication of the digital sabotage confirmed Alex's involvement and suggested that the crew had moved beyond simple intimidation into active sabotage of her professional responsibilities. This escalation crossed the line from harassment into behavior that could genuinely damage her career and reputation, forcing Sarah to acknowledge that defensive strategies were no longer adequate to protect what she had worked years to build. Sarah spent her lunch period documenting the digital intrusions and began the process of securing her accounts and files. But more importantly, she began implementing a strategy that drew on both her teaching experience and her martial arts training. If the crew wanted to test her boundaries, she would give them an opportunity to discover exactly where those boundaries were located. Her first move was to restructure her classroom environment in ways that would give her tactical advantages while appearing to be simple pedagogical improvements. She rearranged the seating to eliminate blind spots and ensure that she could observe every student while maintaining freedom of movement. She positioned her desk to provide multiple exit routes and clear sight lines to both the door and the windows. Most subtly, she began incorporating physical movement into her lessons, using gestures and positioning that kept her body language relaxed but ready. These changes were imperceptible to most students but sent a clear message to anyone with training in reading body language and spatial awareness. Sarah was no longer simply enduring the harassment, but was actively preparing for escalation. She was, in effect, accepting their challenge while establishing the terms under which any confrontation would occur. The crew noticed these changes immediately, though they interpreted them differently according to their individual perspectives. Ryan saw them as evidence that their teacher was becoming more defensive and might be reaching her breaking point. Alex recognized them as tactical preparations and became genuinely concerned about what capabilities they might reveal. Brandon, however, interpreted the changes as a sign that their campaign was succeeding, and that increased pressure would soon force Sarah into either submission or a response that would discredit her professionally. This misreading of Sarah's intentions led Brandon to approve the most aggressive phase of their campaign yet. Rather than waiting for parent-teacher conferences to create administrative pressure, he decided to force a public confrontation that would compel Sarah to either back down or reveal whatever defensive capabilities she might possess. The plan he developed was designed to corner her in a situation where she would have no good options, and where any response would either demonstrate weakness or appear disproportionate to outside observers. The opportunity came during the following week's assembly about college preparation, when Sarah was scheduled to present information about literature requirements for university admission. Brandon arranged for a coordinated disruption that would test her ability to maintain control of a large group while dealing with multiple sources of interference simultaneously. The plan involved students throughout the auditorium creating disturbances at precisely timed intervals, building to a crescendo that would either force Sarah to abandon her presentation or resort to increasingly desperate attempts to restore order. What Brandon didn't realize was that his plan would finally push Sarah past the threshold where defensive tactics became inadequate to protect her professional mission. Master Tanaka had taught her that there were times when the only way to preserve peace was to demonstrate convincingly that continued aggression would result in consequences that far exceeded any possible benefit. The moment for such a demonstration was approaching rapidly, and when it arrived, everyone involved would discover the difference between a teacher who avoided conflict and a warrior who had simply been choosing her battles carefully. Sarah prepared for the assembly with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized her approach to everything from lesson planning to martial arts training. She reviewed her presentation materials, considered potential disruption scenarios, and mentally rehearsed responses that would allow her to maintain her educational mission while addressing whatever challenges might arise. She also made a decision that would have surprised her younger self. If forced to choose between her career and her principles, she would choose her principles and trust that her skills and integrity would eventually create new opportunities. The assembly was scheduled for Friday afternoon, when student attention was typically at its lowest and disruptions were most likely to occur naturally. Sarah arrived at the auditorium early to familiarize herself with the space and to position herself advantageously for whatever might unfold. As students filed in for the presentation, she noticed the crew distributing themselves strategically throughout the audience, confirming her suspicion that they had planned something significant. Brandon took a seat in the middle section where he would have maximum visibility for whatever signal system they had developed. Ryan positioned himself near one of the side exits, looking increasingly uncomfortable with whatever role he had been assigned. Alex chose a seat in the front row where he could observe Sarah's reactions closely and coordinate any technological aspects of their plan. As Sarah began her presentation about the importance of literary analysis in college admission essays, she could feel the tension building in the auditorium like the atmospheric pressure before a thunderstorm. Students who were normally engaged with her teaching seemed nervous and distracted, while those who typically caused minor disruptions appeared unusually focused and alert. The entire dynamic felt artificial and choreographed in a way that confirmed her suspicions about the scope of whatever the crew had planned. The first disruption came 15 minutes into her presentation, when a student in the back row began loudly questioning the relevance of studying dead white authors in an increasingly diverse world. Sarah recognized the provocative language as designed to create controversy rather than genuine dialogue, but she responded with the same thoughtful engagement she brought to legitimate student concerns, using the interruption as an opportunity to discuss how literary canons evolve and why exposure to multiple perspectives enriches rather than diminishes education. The second disruption followed 5 minutes later, when several students began talking loudly about their weekend plans, forcing Sarah to pause her presentation and address the behavior directly. Again, she handled the situation professionally while noting the coordinated timing that suggested orchestration rather than spontaneous teenage restlessness. The pattern continued with increasing intensity, questions designed to embarrass rather than illuminate, technical difficulties that appeared at precisely the wrong moments, and behavioral disruptions that forced Sarah to divide her attention between her educational mission and crowd control. Each incident was plausibly deniable as normal teenage behavior, but the cumulative effect was clearly designed to overwhelm her ability to maintain order and complete her presentation successfully. As the disruptions escalated, Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of patience and professional skill that had been developed through years of teaching in challenging environments. But she also began to feel the familiar sensation that preceded combat in martial arts: the heightened awareness, the slowing of time, and the crystal-clear understanding that a moment of decision was approaching rapidly. The turning point came when Brandon stood up in the middle of the auditorium and began a speech about how outdated teaching methods were failing to prepare students for the modern world. His words were carefully chosen to sound like legitimate educational criticism, but his tone and timing made it clear that this was the culmination of weeks of psychological warfare rather than spontaneous student advocacy. As Brandon continued his performance, designed to force Sarah into either backing down or appearing authoritarian in front of the entire school, he made a critical error in judgment. He stepped into the aisle and began moving toward the front of the auditorium, using his physical presence to intimidate while maintaining the pretense of academic discourse. This movement transformed the situation from verbal disruption into something approaching physical confrontation, crossing the line that Sarah had been hoping to avoid. In that moment, Sarah Chen made a decision that would change everything. Rather than continuing to absorb aggression in hopes that patience would eventually prevail, she chose to demonstrate exactly why 15 years of martial arts training had made her someone who could afford to be patient. The demonstration would be controlled, proportionate, and precisely calibrated to achieve maximum educational impact with minimum actual conflict. But it would also be unmistakably clear in its message. The testing phase was over, and continued aggression would meet with responses that were far more sophisticated and effective than anything the crew had encountered before. The moment had arrived for Sarah to reveal that her preference for peace had never been rooted in weakness, but in the confidence that came from knowing she could protect what mattered most whenever such protection became necessary. Brandon Mitchell was about to learn the difference between someone who couldn't fight and someone who simply chose not to, and that lesson would transform not just his own understanding, but the entire social dynamic that had governed Riverside Academy for far too long. The auditorium fell silent as Brandon continued his theatrical march toward the front, his voice echoing through the space with practiced authority. Sarah stood motionless behind the podium, her hands resting calmly on her presentation notes, while her mind processed the situation with the clarity that years of martial arts training had ingrained in her consciousness. Every student in the auditorium was watching, waiting to see how their English teacher would respond to this public challenge to her authority and competence. Brandon had calculated that this moment would force Sarah into an impossible choice: either submit to his dominance in front of the entire school, or attempt to assert control in ways that would make her appear unreasonable and potentially unstable. He had seen this strategy work before with other teachers, creating situations where any response seemed to validate his position while diminishing theirs. What he hadn't anticipated was facing someone who understood that there were more than two options available. Sarah stepped away from the podium with fluid grace, moving to a position that gave her clear sight lines throughout the auditorium, while placing herself at an angle that made Brandon's approach seem aggressive rather than academic. Her movement was so natural that most observers didn't consciously notice the strategic repositioning, but everyone felt the subtle shift in energy that occurred when someone truly confident in their capabilities stopped retreating and began claiming space. "Brandon," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without any need for amplification, "I appreciate your passion for educational reform. Why don't you come up here and share your ideas with everyone properly, rather than trying to conduct a discussion from the middle of the aisle?" The invitation was delivered with such genuine warmth that it took Brandon several seconds to realize he had been outmaneuvered. By inviting him to join her at the front, rather than ordering him to sit down, Sarah had transformed his attempted intimidation into a legitimate educational opportunity, while simultaneously exposing the theatrical nature of his approach. If he accepted, he would be participating in her presentation rather than disrupting it. If he refused, he would appear to be more interested in causing problems than sharing ideas. Brandon hesitated, his confidence wavering as he recognized that his carefully planned disruption had been redirected in ways he hadn't anticipated. The murmur of student conversation that had been supporting his performance began to shift as his classmates waited to see whether he would accept Sarah's challenge or reveal that his interest was in causing disruption rather than meaningful dialogue. Alex Kim, observing from the front row, felt a chill of recognition as he watched his teacher's masterful handling of the situation. He had studied enough psychology and strategic thinking to understand that Sarah had just demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that suggested extensive training in conflict management. More troubling was the way she moved and positioned herself, with the kind of spatial awareness that he associated with people who had serious martial arts backgrounds. The realization hit Alex like a physical blow. They weren't dealing with an inexperienced teacher who could be intimidated through persistence and escalation. They were facing someone who had been allowing them to reveal their capabilities and intentions while she assessed the full scope of the threat they represented. Every move they had made, every strategy they had employed, had been observed and catalogued by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Alex made a decision that would save his academic future and potentially his physical well-being. Rising from his seat, he spoke clearly enough for everyone in the auditorium to hear, "Brandon, maybe we should let Ms. Chen finish her presentation. I think people actually want to hear what she has to say about college requirements." The intervention shattered the coordinated nature of the crew's disruption, revealing to everyone present that this had been a planned attack rather than spontaneous student engagement. Brandon turned to stare at his friend with a mixture of betrayal and fury, unable to understand why Alex would abandon their carefully orchestrated campaign at its crucial moment. Ryan, who had been positioned near the side exit with growing reluctance about his role in the escalating conflict, saw Alex's defection as permission to follow his own conscience. "Yeah, Brandon," he called out, his voice carrying more confidence than he had felt in months. "Sit down, man. This is actually important stuff for people who want to go to college." The collapse of his support system left Brandon isolated in the middle of the auditorium, his moment of triumph transformed into public humiliation. The murmur of student conversation grew louder as his classmates began to understand that they had been witnesses to an attempted bullying campaign, rather than legitimate educational discourse. Several students who had been quietly supportive of Sarah throughout the semester began to speak up, expressing interest in hearing the rest of her presentation and suggesting that Brandon return to his seat. Sarah watched the dissolution of Brandon's power base with the same calm attention she brought to observing sparring matches in the dojo. She felt no satisfaction in his humiliation, understanding that cornered opponents often became more dangerous rather than less. Master Tanaka had taught her that victory in martial arts was never about defeating an opponent, but about creating conditions where conflict became unnecessary. The ideal outcome was not conquest, but transformation, turning enemies into allies or at least neutral parties who no longer posed threats. "Brandon," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the rising noise in the auditorium, "the invitation is still open. You clearly have strong feelings about education, and I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. But if you'd prefer to continue this conversation privately, my office hours are posted on my door." The offer gave Brandon a face-saving exit that acknowledged his concerns while re-establishing appropriate boundaries for educational discourse. A wiser student would have accepted the gracious alternative and used it as an opportunity to rebuild his reputation through constructive engagement. Brandon, however, was too invested in his identity as someone who couldn't be challenged or redirected to recognize the lifeline he was being offered. Instead, he made the decision that would define the remainder of his high school experience and demonstrate to everyone present why Sarah Chen had spent 15 years learning to defend herself and others. "I don't think you understand how things work around here," he said, his voice rising as he abandoned any pretense of academic discussion. "New teachers don't get to lecture students about appropriate behavior until they prove they deserve respect." As he spoke, Brandon began moving toward the front of the auditorium again, but this time his body language was overtly aggressive rather than theatrically passionate. His hands were clenched, his shoulders squared, and his approach carried the unmistakable intent to intimidate through physical presence. Several students in the front rows began to shift uncomfortably, recognizing that the situation was moving beyond verbal confrontation into potentially dangerous territory. Sarah felt the familiar slowing of time that occurred when her martial arts training engaged fully. She could see Brandon's approach pattern, assess his emotional state, and calculate multiple response options simultaneously. More importantly, she could sense the fear beginning to spread through the auditorium as students realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in their school experience. The educational environment she had worked so hard to create was being threatened not just for her classes, but for everyone who had gathered to learn about college preparation. The moment of decision arrived when Brandon stepped onto the stage area, moving within arm's reach of Sarah while continuing his verbal assault on her authority and competence. His positioning was clearly intended to use his height and physical presence to force her into backing down, a tactic that had undoubtedly worked for him in countless previous encounters. What he discovered instead was that intimidation only works against people who are actually intimidated. Sarah's response was so swift and controlled that most observers initially couldn't process what they had witnessed. As Brandon raised his hand in what appeared to be either a pointing gesture or the beginning of a more aggressive movement, Sarah stepped slightly to one side and guided his extended arm in a direction that sent him stumbling past her toward the rear of the stage. The movement looked almost like a dance step, so fluid and natural that it took several seconds for people to realize that their teacher had just demonstrated a level of physical capability that none of them had suspected. Brandon, off balance and confused by the unexpected failure of his intimidation attempt, spun around to face Sarah with genuine anger replacing his calculated aggression. "What did you just do?" he demanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that undermined the authority he was trying to project. "I stepped out of your way," Sarah replied with perfect honesty, her tone suggesting that she was genuinely puzzled by his question. "You seemed to be moving toward the back of the stage, so I made room for you to pass." The response was technically accurate while being completely disingenuous, a form of verbal aikido that used Brandon's own momentum against him. By describing his stumble as intentional movement and her defensive technique as simple courtesy, Sarah had made it impossible for him to complain about her actions without admitting that he had been attempting to intimidate her physically. Alex Kim, watching from the front row with growing alarm, recognized that his former leader was approaching a point of no return. He had seen Brandon in enough conflicts to know that being made to look foolish in public would trigger an escalation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that Sarah Chen was someone who could handle whatever escalation Brandon might attempt, and that the outcome would not favor his former friend. "Brandon," Alex called out, his voice urgent with genuine concern. "Just leave it alone, man. This isn't worth it." The plea fell on deaf ears. Brandon was too invested in his public image, and too accustomed to getting his way through persistence and aggression, to recognize that he was facing someone who operated according to entirely different rules. Instead of de-escalating, he made the decision that would provide every student at Riverside Academy with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. "Nobody talks to me like that," Brandon declared, moving towards Sarah again with obvious intent to use physical contact to re-establish his dominance. "I don't care what kind of games you think you're playing." What happened next lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but would be replayed and analyzed by witnesses for years afterward. As Brandon reached towards Sarah with clear intent to grab or push her, she moved with the kind of controlled precision that can only come from years of dedicated training. Her response was not the wild flailing of someone panicking under pressure, nor the brutal efficiency of someone seeking to cause maximum damage. Instead, it was the measured application of exactly enough force to neutralize a threat while demonstrating capabilities that would discourage future challenges. Sarah's left hand intercepted Brandon's reaching arm, controlling his movement while her right hand found pressure points that instantly compromised his balance and strength. In a single flowing motion, she guided him to the floor of the stage in what looked to most observers like an elaborate stumble, but which left Brandon lying on his back with Sarah standing calmly beside him, completely unruffled by the encounter. The auditorium erupted in gasps, exclamations, and the kind of excited chatter that follows any dramatic event in a high school setting. Students who had never seen real martial arts in action were struggling to process what they had witnessed, while those with some training in combat sports were wide-eyed with recognition of the skill level they had just observed. Brandon lay on the stage for several seconds, more stunned by the sudden reversal of his expected dominance than by any physical discomfort. He had never encountered someone who could neutralize his advantages so completely and effortlessly, and the experience was fundamentally disorienting. When he finally struggled to his feet, his face was flushed with embarrassment and fury. But there was also something new in his expression, the first genuine uncertainty he had shown in years. Sarah stepped back to give him space to stand, her posture relaxed but alert. "Are you injured?" she asked, her voice carrying what appeared to be genuine concern. "That was quite a stumble. Maybe you should sit down for a few minutes." Again, her response was technically accurate while being strategically brilliant. By expressing concern for his well-being and describing his takedown as an accidental fall, she was offering him another opportunity to exit the situation with some dignity intact. More importantly, she was establishing for every witness that she had used only the minimum force necessary to protect herself, and had shown immediate concern for his welfare afterward. Principal Matthews, who had been summoned by a student text message, and had arrived just in time to witness the conclusion of the confrontation, stood in the back of the auditorium trying to process what he had observed. As a former military officer, he recognized the level of training required to execute the kind of controlled takedown he had just seen. As an educational administrator, he understood that he was dealing with a situation unlike anything in his professional experience. Brandon, meanwhile, was facing the complete collapse of the reputation and authority that had defined his identity for 3 years. Every student in the auditorium had witnessed his humiliation, and the story would spread throughout the school within hours. More devastating was the realization that his opponent had demonstrated such superior capability while showing obvious restraint and concern for his well-being. He had not been defeated by someone angry or cruel, but by someone who possessed skills he couldn't match and wisdom he couldn't understand. The moment that followed would determine whether Brandon would learn from the experience or double down on destructive behavior that could only lead to worse consequences. Sarah, watching his internal struggle with the compassion of someone who understood that bullies were often as trapped by their patterns as their victims, made a choice that surprised everyone present. "Brandon," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the now silent auditorium, "I know you're upset, and I understand why. No one likes to feel powerless or out of control. But real strength isn't about making other people afraid of you. It's about having enough confidence in yourself that you don't need to prove anything to anyone else." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "You're clearly intelligent and charismatic. You could be a real leader in this school if you chose to use those gifts to help people instead of intimidating them. The choice is yours, but the path you've been on only leads to isolation and consequences that get more serious as you get older." The speech was delivered without condescension or triumph, but with the kind of genuine concern that a teacher might show for any student who was making destructive choices. Several students in the audience found themselves nodding in recognition of truths they had been afraid to voice, while others looked at Brandon with new understanding of the insecurity that had driven his need to dominate others. Brandon stood frozen for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions as he processed both his defeat and the unexpected compassion of his opponent. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "This isn't over." "Yes," Sarah replied with quiet certainty. "It is." The finality in her voice was not threatening but absolute, carrying the weight of someone who had just demonstrated that she possessed both the capability and the wisdom to end any future conflicts before they could escalate to dangerous levels. Brandon looked around the auditorium at faces that showed everything from sympathy to disappointment to outright relief, and realized that his reign as the unofficial king of Riverside Academy had ended in the most public way possible. Principal Matthews approached the stage. As students began to file out of the auditorium, their excited conversations already transforming the day's events into legend. "Ms. Chen," he said formally, "I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." Sarah nodded, understanding that there would be administrative procedures to follow and documentation to complete. "Of course. I have all my lesson plans and materials if you need to review them, and I'm happy to provide any information about my background that might be relevant to your investigation." The principal's expression softened slightly. "Actually, I think the investigation will be fairly straightforward. We have about 200 witnesses who saw a student attempt to physically intimidate a teacher and saw that teacher defend herself with appropriate restraint. What I'm more interested in is understanding how we prevent situations like this from developing in the future." Over the following weeks, the transformation at Riverside Academy was remarkable. Brandon, faced with a choice between accepting responsibility for his actions or facing expulsion, chose to participate in a restorative justice program that required him to understand the impact of his behavior on other students and to make amends through community service. The process was humbling, but ultimately educational, helping him develop the genuine leadership skills that Sarah had recognized beneath his destructive patterns. Alex Kim, relieved to be free from the crew's toxic dynamics, threw himself into computer programming projects and began tutoring younger students in technology skills. His intelligence, no longer directed toward psychological warfare, made him a valuable resource for both teachers and classmates who were struggling with digital literacy challenges. Ryan Torres, perhaps the most transformed of the three, approached Sarah privately to apologize for his role in the harassment campaign and to ask if he could join her after-school tutoring program. His genuine remorse and desire to make better choices earned him not only Sarah's forgiveness, but her active support in developing academic skills that helped him qualify for a community college program he had never thought accessible. Sarah's reputation throughout the school evolved from that of the new English teacher to something approaching legendary status, but not for the reasons outsiders might have expected. Students respected her not because she had demonstrated the ability to defend herself, but because she had combined that capability with wisdom, restraint, and genuine care for even those who had tried to harm her. Her classes became the most popular in the school, not because they were easy, but because students knew they were safe spaces, where intelligence was valued, creativity was encouraged, and every individual was seen as capable of growth and transformation. The bullying culture that had infected various aspects of school life began to wither as students realized that there were alternatives to the dynamics of dominance and submission that had previously seemed inevitable. Emma, the shy poet who had warned Sarah about the crew's plans, blossomed into a confident young woman who went on to win a national writing contest and earned scholarships to several prestigious universities. David, the supposed troublemaker who had shown insight during literature discussions, became a peer mediator who helped other students resolve conflicts before they escalated to administrative intervention. Most significantly, the story of what had happened in the auditorium spread far beyond Riverside Academy, becoming a teaching case study about the importance of hiring educators who possessed not just academic credentials, but the personal strength and wisdom to create truly safe learning environments. Sarah received job offers from several districts, but chose to remain at Riverside Academy, where she felt her work was making the greatest difference. Master Tanaka, when Sarah told him about the events, nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had successfully applied years of training to real-world challenges. "You understand now," he said, "that the highest level of martial arts is not about defeating opponents, but about creating conditions where defeating them becomes unnecessary. You transformed enemies into allies, and that is the most difficult technique of all." Years later, when former students returned to visit Riverside Academy, they invariably stopped by Sarah's classroom to thank her for lessons that extended far beyond literature and writing. They had learned that real strength came from the combination of capability and compassion, that conflicts could be resolved without anyone being destroyed, and that the most powerful response to aggression was often patience, combined with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly where one's boundaries lay. Brandon Mitchell, now a successful social worker who specialized in helping troubled teenagers, often told the story of his encounter with Sarah Chen as a turning point that had saved him from a path that would have led to far more serious consequences. He had learned that respect couldn't be demanded or taken by force, but had to be earned through actions that demonstrated character and integrity. The legacy of that afternoon in the auditorium became woven into the culture of Riverside Academy, a reminder that true authority came not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the wisdom to know when and how to use one's capabilities in service of something larger than oneself. Sarah Chen had taught an entire school community that the most powerful weapon against bullying was not fear or punishment, but the demonstration that strength and kindness were not opposites, but essential partners in creating environments where everyone could thrive. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.